of the Max Ferguson Show. Once again, CBC Radio brings you the Max Ferguson Show. And now, here's Max.
Thank you, Alan. Skyrockets and sparklers going off in that voice as he introduces, of course, the Victoria Day edition of our program.
I made my own gunpowder years ago.
Did you?
Uh-huh.
I didn't spend a cent on firecrackers as a boy. Now, this is interesting because you're the first. I used to scrounge, beg, borrow, and steal, usually with two chums. We went in on it to raise 25 cents. And with that 25 cents, we raced down to, I've forgotten the name of the hardware store. But we bought a tin full of calcium carbide.
Yeah, well, that's terrible stuff.
Oh, how we survived those explosions. How did you make your gunpowder?
Well, I made it the proper way, the old Chinese method.
Did you really?
Charcoal, sulfur, and I think it's sodium nitrate.
Probably.
No, sodium nitrate, nitrate. There are three parts. I used to know the formula. I don't know.
But the trouble with the calcium carbide, it produces acetylene gas from the old
sure
bicycle
does.
lamps.
Yeah.
But you never know the proportion of air to acetylene gas.
Of course not, you would.
And we're blowing tins up into the air 50 feet, and then we put a quart milk bottle over this escaping gas.
Oh, that's
put
a good
match
idea.
in. How
That's nice.
It went into slivers, none bigger than an inch. How we missed it. Peering right at it a foot away.
Yeah, I thought those were just wrinkles in your face, but they're not.
I blew a chum into the air 6-7 feet. He was recovering from scarlet fever. And he had to sit in a little chair and check his pulse every 5 minutes under doctor's order, just recovering. And I was entertaining him in the garden by blowing up various tins. And he had a kind of an inquiring mind. And he said, I wonder if that would lift a human being. And I said, well, there's one way to find out. Stand on the tin. So he stood on the tin. It was a great big Jacob biscuit tin. And had a little hole punched in it so the acetylene gas could come up out of the water. And I put the match to it. And he went up into a beautiful back dive in the layout position and landed in a bed full of irises. Still checking his pulse. We're on the CBC network, Alan,
Yes,
coast
yes.
to coast.
Mm-hmm.
For Victoria Day, we're going to have the Royal Choral Society, the London Philharmonic Orchestra, London Philharmonic Orchestra,
Yeah.
conducted jointly by the late Sir Arthur Bliss
You couldn't have done better. That's just a wonderful thing on a day like this.
and Andrew Davis, who is now with our Toronto Symphony Orchestra.
Oh, that's good.
I am not going to even give the name of this piece of music.
Because we'll all know it all.
Oh,
yeah.
but you may not recognize it under this, the best arrangement of it I have ever heard done. And it was arranged by this Sir Arthur Bliss. That was a spirited version of the anthem God Save the Queen, played by the London Philharmonic under the direction of Sir Arthur Bliss and Andrew Davis and the Royal Choral Society. And you manfully, in spite of the bad kneecaps, managed to stand throughout.
Oh, well, one could not resist that. Gosh, magnificent rendition.
Here is the voice of Frederick Mead. He was 90 when this recording was made for the BBC, and incredibly enough, he is giving an eyewitness account in this day and age of Wellington's funeral. When Wellington died, Queen Victoria said that this was the greatest man produced by England. Now that's a tribute, because that rules out Drake, Nelson, Sir Walter Raleigh, Ben Wicks, all those memorable names. Here, then, is Frederick Mead, age 90, remembering, watching as a child, England in mourning for the Duke of Wellington.
From the death of Wellington, Queen Victoria proclaimed that he was the greatest man the country ever produced. He died on the 14th September 1852. An embalming must have taken place, for the funeral was long deferred. The body was removed from Walmer Castle on the 11th of November to Chelsea Hospital, that in its hall there might be the lying in state. I lived in Chelsea at the time, so that local interest was added to the excitement. I remember being shocked to learn that 5 persons were crushed to death at the gates of the hospital. Owing to the enormous crowd, described at the time as follows. The actual words were, "The multitude actually smoked like a heated haystack from the pressure and strain upon individuals." With the object of our seeing everything, my brother and I were entrusted to an uncle that he might take us to see the lying in state. The police had then taken precautions to prevent further fatalities, and their directions were that the intending sightseers should enter from the King's Road, Chelsea, the open gravel space in the centre of Royal Avenue, as it is now called, leading to Burton Court, and thence to the cupola of the hospital, the hall where the solemn spectacle took place being to the right. We were formed into groups of about 50 people each, at intervals of about 10 yards, these extending the whole quarter of a mile of the route. From time to time, as progress was made, all these groups in close formation were allowed to shuffle forward the distance to be gained. I do not know what time this penitential, purgatorial pilgrimage occupied, but the flow must have been fairly rapid, as on the last 3 days of the spectacle, 50,000, 60,000, and 63,000 respectively passed through the hall. I was not sorry that in a short time our uncle thought that our attaining our object in a reasonable time was hopeless, and therefore withdrew us from the feted group into which we had been shepherded. To view the funeral procession, seats had been secured in a shop in Fleet Street, where the law courts now stand, a few doors west of Temple Bar, which was decorated, as I thought, very beautifully. My parents seemed to have been affected by that feverish anxiety as to reaching the ceremonial in time. The result being that on the vital morning of the 18th of November, I was aroused from my bed by candlelight. The gas was not laid on until some years after. To reach Fleet Street, we adopted our usual means of locomotion to the city, by steamboat from the Cadogan Pier, disembarking at the Temple. Contrary to expectation, there was no crowd, so that we made the voyage in comfort. There is no doubt that in its impressive and elaborate pageantry, the funeral of the Duke of Wellington would vie with any which has taken place before or since. It was attended by royalty in the person of Prince Albert, and by distinguished persons, both English and foreign. Naturally, the impression which such spectacular splendour made upon my mind was passed away, but the appearance of the funeral car, so appropriately caparisoned with a hero's hat and sword on the coffin, gave me great delight. It was drawn by 12 horses and weighed 12 tons. What necessity there was for so heavy an equipage, it is difficult to understand. The presence in the procession of 83 Chelsea pensioners, the number corresponding with the age and years of the Duke, pleased me much, as seeing them daily in the Chelsea streets, I looked upon them as old friends. My mother remarked upon their tired appearance, which was owing, no doubt, to their having walked from Chelsea. There being, too, one may assume, as is customary in military diversions, hours of unnecessary standing about. The majority, if not all, may have beheld the Duke when commanding in India, the Peninsula, or at Waterloo. After the lamentable loss of life at the lying in state, the police were keen to avoid a similar calamity. As if eager to follow the procession, an enormous crowd appeared on the south side of St. Clement's Danes Church. There was no embankment in those days, and possibly it was feared that as there was no outlet, the crowd would be congested at the bottleneck Temple Bar. I remember that the police closed up across the road and belaboured the crowd with their truncheons. The result being that under the warmth of this reception, it soon melted away.
An incredible eyewitness account of the funeral of the Duke of Wellington, recounted by Frederick Mead, who was 90 when that was made for the BBC. Two great major wars during Queen Victoria's reign. Quickly, Alan.
What?
The two wars in her reign.
It's your program. Go ahead. Boer War and the rest.
Boer War and the Crimean.
Yeah, that's right.
Both fell within her
That's right.
reign. From the Boer War came this fine song, which also turned up in World War I, but it was a Boer War song. Here it is, sung by a crowd in Flanagan's pub in London. Goodbye, Dolly Gray. Selections from Victorian England, Goodbye Dolly Gray and Don't Dilly-Dally on the Way. I always maintain on this 24th of May that one group that should not be excluded from anything attempting to commemorate the occasion would be the old pensioners, many of whom fought for Victoria in her wars. They're living out the twilight years of their lives in the Chelsea home in London, some of them into their 90s, and they're going to offer now a song that just is imbued with the whole spirit of the Victorian age. Its good points and its bad, its artificiality. She was only a bird in a gilded cage. Records brought those chaps into their studios, and I suspect that a few Bass and Worthington were floating around, because it degenerates on side two. The closer to the end you get, the
Pye plied them, probably.
Pye plied them, indeed. What a raw deal they were, sir. Perhaps this is not the day on which to mention it, but have you read the history? The only encounter you've had with the Chelsea Chancellors,
the
nice Chelsea
group.
Pensioners, was a sad one, Alan, because you interviewed two who came to Toronto. Neither one have ever heard of the
They'd never
the
heard
whole.
of them. No, they'd never heard of the home. They'd never heard of a choir, and they'd
Never heard of a name.
No. I said, well, it's from the Max Ferguson. Who's he?
That's understandable.
Yeah, but no, they'd heard of nothing. Dermot Kenny and I went. We were both baffled.
They've been going for years. As a matter of fact, they were mentioned earlier in the program on that account of Wellington's funeral. 83 Chelsea pensioners, symbolizing
Yes, I heard that.
Duke of Wellington's age. But the most tragic period in their history was after the Peninsula Wars, fighting for Wellington. Half of them wounded, with legs missing, and what have you, living on in the Chelsea home in London on a very, very modest pension. And the government decided to get rid of this expense of the pension and made them an offer which is pretty close to duplicity. None of them understood it, but they were going to be taken and shipped out to Canada and given tracts of land. And these guys who had never had anything to do with farming are dumped off in the wilds of northern Canada and northern Quebec and Ontario, and a lot of them just became alcoholics, drifting around until they died of exposure. We'll listen to them once again, and who has a better right to sing this song than these chaps, most of whom who are actually singing were indeed soldiers of the Queen, meaning Victoria rather than our present Queen. Here they are with this great old Victorian song, Soldiers of the Queen.
Soldiers of the Queen.
to conclude this Victoria Day salute, the melody that lifted a gloomy, depressed England out of its doldrums when a handful of Dutch farmers were running circles around the cream of the British regiments in the Boer War in the early years. But there's always a Drake who steps onto the history's page at the needed time, and in this case, it was a composer, Edward Elgar, who says, in his own words, that he wrote this next selection to bolster the lagging morale of Englishmen. Here is a portion of Land of Hope and Glory by Elgar, played by the GUS Footwear Band, and near the end of it, one of the most exciting sounds as the entire Morrison Orpheus Male Voice Choir of Wales bursts forth with the familiar lyrics of Land of Hope and Glory.
CBC Radio.